A massive, jagged rock stands defiant in the middle of San Francisco Bay. That is Alcatraz. It is the night of June 11th, 1962. The world is pitch black, and the only sound breaking the silence is the rhythmic crashing of the freezing Pacific waves. Right here, in the center of the bay, sits the most secure prison on the planet. A place where escaping isn't just difficult, it is supposed to be impossible. But on this specific night, something happened that would leave the world scratching its head for decades. When the guards went to check the cells the next morning, they were met with a sight that made their blood run cold. The beds were not empty, but the men were gone. In their place sat 3 incredibly realistic heads made of paper and soap. 3 inmates have vanished into thin air. No sirens, no gunshots, just a haunting silence. Did they actually pull off the greatest escape in history, or did the ocean swallow them whole? Alcatraz was known simply as the Rock. It was surrounded by miles of churning, ice-cold water. The currents were so strong and the temperature so low that even the strongest swimmer wouldn't last more than a few minutes. On top of that, the security was legendary. Armed guards, towers, and the latest technology of the time made it the final stop for America's most dangerous criminals. This was the place they sent you when you had already broken out of every other prison. No one had ever successfully escaped from here. But 3 men, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were about to challenge that reputation. Frank Morris was the brains of the operation. He had a genius-level IQ and a knack for finding the weak spots in any system. The prison files described him as highly intelligent and incredibly dangerous because of his ability to think steps ahead of everyone else. The Anglin brothers were his partners in crime. Together, they began a plan that was as crazy as it was brilliant. They knew the front door was out of the question. Instead, they looked at the old ventilation ducts behind their cells. The problem? The walls were 6 inches of solid concrete. To get through, they needed tools. They managed to steal a motor from a broken vacuum cleaner and built a makeshift drill. For months, they worked in the shadows. Every night, when the prison music hour started, they used the noise as a cover to chip away at the concrete. It was a slow, grueling process. They were working in tiny, cramped spaces, barely able to breathe, with the constant fear of a guard walking by. One mistake, one loud bang at the wrong time, and they would be in solitary confinement for life. But they were driven by a desperate need for freedom. They didn't just want to leave, they wanted to prove that the Rock could be beaten. The most famous part of their plan was the decoys. They knew the guards checked the cells with flashlights every hour throughout the night. To buy themselves time, they spent weeks crafting 3 dummy heads. They used a mixture of toilet paper, soap, and toothpaste to mold the faces. To make them look real, they even glued on actual hair stolen from the prison barbershop and painted them with scraps of art supplies. In the dim light of a jail cell, under a tucked-in blanket, those heads looked exactly like sleeping men. Those decoys were their golden ticket. They gave the trio a several-hour head start before anyone realized they were missing. But getting out of the cell was only half the battle. They still had to cross the water. Over several months, they managed to steal over 50 rubber raincoats. Using heat from the steam pipes, they welded the coats together to create a massive inflatable raft. They even carved wooden paddles by hand. They did all of this in a hidden area on top of the cell block, right under the noses of the guards. They knew the odds were against them. The water was lethal, and the currents were unpredictable. but they were willing to bet their lives on a pile of glued-together raincoats. On that fateful night in June, the plane went live. Around 9:30 p.m., they placed the dummy heads in their beds and crawled through the holes they had spent months digging. They climbed up the plumbing pipes, reached the roof, and sneaked across the top of the prison. They dropped 50 feet down to the water's edge, avoiding the sweeping searchlights of the towers. Standing on the edge of that island, looking out at the dark, freezing bay, they knew there was no turning back. They inflated their makeshift raft using an accordion-like instrument and pushed off into the abyss. Can you imagine the adrenaline? The cold wind hitting their faces, the sound of the water, and the knowledge that if that raft popped, they were dead men. The next morning, the prison erupted in chaos. The sirens wailed across the bay. The FBI, the Coast Guard, and the military launched a massive manhunt. They searched every inch of the water in the surrounding islands. They found a few clues, a floating paddle, a piece of a raincoat, and a handmade wallet, but no bodies. Not a single one. The official theory from the authorities was that they drowned. They argued that the water was just too cold and the currents too strong for a homemade raft to survive. But the mystery didn't end there. Soon after the escape, the Anglin family started receiving strange, anonymous postcards with no return address. One simply said, "We made it." Years turned into decades, and the legend only grew. In the 1970s, a photo surfaced that was allegedly taken in Brazil. It showed two men who looked remarkably like the Anglin brothers standing by a road. Forensic experts couldn't 100% prove it was them, but they couldn't rule it out either. This single photo kept the mystery alive for a whole new generation. Did they really navigate those deadly currents, reach the mainland, and disappear into a new life in South America? Alcatraz eventually closed down just a year later, partly because of the embarrassment of this escape and partly because it was too expensive to run. Today, it is a place for tourists to visit, but the ghost of that escape still lingers in the halls. You can still see the holes they dug and the vents they climbed through. The story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers isn't just a crime story, it's a story about the human spirit. It shows us that no matter how many walls you build or how many guards you station, you can't truly cage a person who is determined to be free. Their escape remains the greatest cold case in the history of the American prison system. Do you think they actually made it to the shore? Or is the ocean still holding on to their secret? It's a question that might never be answered. Interestingly, in the 1970s, a man claimed he saw Frank Morris living a quiet life in the mountains. Maybe the story didn't end in the water. Maybe the real story is only known by the three men who stepped into the dark that night and vanished.
Welcome to Crime Reveals.